The first question then is this. Even with IRB oversight and informed consent, how can study participants, that's including the families, be assured that researchers conducting clinical trials are doing so in an ethical manner and have the best interest of the study participants in mind? Are there standards that are developed or published, and what are, for example, FDA protections?
So I was asked to do a couple things in my initial response to this question, and one was to just help us focus on what ethics is, and I think that the way that I think about ethics is it's a team sport about what ought to be done in a particular situation, and by a team sport I really mean that in terms of exactly the kinds of discussions that we will be having tonight. That is, it's truth that can be discovered through discussions. There are also obviously protections based on ethical principles that go way back to help protect study subjects in research. And part of my job at FDA, well, I mean really the part of my job at FDA, is to figure out how to apply those protections to children in research. And so for those of you that like to Google, you can look up the regulations that are based on ethical principles if you're so inclined. There's ICHE 11, ICHE 6, some of those. There's also the regulations that we apply at FDA that protect children in research are 21 CFR 50, which contain the additional protections for children that are enrolled in clinical trials. Above and beyond those, regarding IRB review and that kind of thing, that also oversee research on adults. So, I'm not sure sort of how much detail would be helpful here, but I just, I think one of the things that I wanted to impress upon all of you is that we take our obligation to protect both children and adults in research very seriously. And that comes from not only these sort of additional protections, but they really start at the level of the individual research protocol. And is this protocol appropriate? Are we going to learn something from this protocol? Because why are we exposing anybody to risks if we can't learn something, if we're not asking the right questions? And so it really goes back to levels far beyond or back much further than informed consent, which has to happen after we've already developed a protocol that we feel like is scientifically sound and ethically appropriate and enrolls an appropriate study population. And so ethics is really part and parcel of the decisions that we make and the careful thinking that we do all the time.
Where's Eileen? Eileen's back there. I was just trying to remember back in November, December, I remember sitting in front of my word processor writing that participant's guide to research, and I remember going back and forth with you trying to get a reality check from you in terms of some of the things I was typing up. Because I was trying to take the perspective of if I was the parent and I was getting ready to enroll my loved one in a trial, and knowing that if it was in a therapeutic area where there just wasn't much out there in terms of precedented treatments that help, what's the perspective I should take? So in what I'm referring to those of you that might not know this, we ultimately put together a participant's guide to research that ended up on Autism Speaks website, I think, just for expedience sake, although we cross-referenced it through your work. But it was really valuable because the exercise I went through with Eileen was trying to think about if I as a parent was new to this notion of having my loved one transition from being a patient to being a research subject, what's the fundamental things that I need to know just to go in there and have a semi-informed conversation with the principal investigator who was going to ask me to sign consent, which is my agreement to have my loved one become a research subject, e.g. to move from being a just regular patient to be a research subject. And then if my child could do this, was going to get their assent, which is their agreement to go from being a patient to being a research subject. And I remember one of the first things that you and I talked about was this notion of how different it is to be just a regular patient versus a research subject, and kind of that arc or that bridge mentally that occurs when one agrees to say, I'm going to become a research participant. And some of that's captured in that guide. And if you have a chance, you all can, I guess, Google it and find it in some way, shape, or form. But I just bring that up because one of the things that we stepped around is this notion of how do you size up this clinician, scientist, investigator who you're sitting in front of, who's just brought up this issue of, will you shift your loved one from being a patient to being one of my research subjects? And the question there was, and we touched upon this a little bit in that participants guide, but we really didn't get into the meaty issue of how do you actually size up that investigator who's asking you to sign your loved one over to be a research subject, and what sort of things should you be looking at? And there were a lot of things that I wanted to say and a lot of things I wanted to write, but it being out there in the public domain and the internet working the way that it is, I didn't write certain things about my personal opinion of how to do that. But I hope we'll be able to talk about some of those things tonight in this context. But having said that, there are some primary or some simple ideas that I would have in terms of how one might go about doing that. And you start off by just asking the individual physician what's in it for them, frankly, and listen to what's their response. So why are you doing this? Kind of, always with a friendly face and a amenable attitude, but what are you getting from this and what have you, and just listen carefully. And then, of course, you always ask that question of, and if the roles were changed and you were the parent and this is your child, would you do this research study that you just put in front of me, and listen carefully to that. And then what's the potential downside, and so forth and so on. And as we go on this evening, we're having this discussion, we can go into a number of those different types of things that you might ask. But just to give you some flavor of the things that are on my mind when I'm thinking about, is this a decent prospect to have my loved one in this study or not? Or do I even want my loved one to switch from being a patient to being a research subject? So there's an art, if you will, to how you can interrogate the investigator to get some sense of where they're coming from. Are they aligned with your best interests? Are they credible?
So these are, you're saying that even though you have an informed consent, these are often very long. They contain all types of information that you have to sign for assurances of ethical behavior. Then you're saying that in addition to that, you want to know these qualitative aspects about the person seeking consent, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's true with any time that we seek, any time that any of us, whether it's our loved ones or us, are in this dependent position of being a patient, we're in trouble. At some level, our body's in distress or what have you. Here I'm talking about medical care. And you all, everybody in the room, everyone that's looking at this film knows what that feeling is like when something's going wrong and you need to get medical care. And it's not a good feeling, and none of us welcome that position. So we start off with that as the primary vulnerability that we face. We're in that situation where we need help, ostensibly, or we're seeking help. Okay. And then from that, this additional issue or complication or consideration comes in around, do you want to do research or not, or do you just want to go straight patient care, whatever that is. Okay. Yeah, and so that's the part that I'm talking about, that you have to bring that into the equation and sort that out in conjunction with, am I going to be well taken care of?
Okay, excellent. Would